Increasingly in our age, science is invoked in our discussions. The prevalence of terms such as scientific consensus or the contrary, conspiracy theory, begs the question, what does it even mean for an idea to be scientific? Your intuition is enough to tell you whether you like how science is going or the opposite. However, this does not mean that we can't get anything out of analyzing the concept at a deeper level with some degree of sincerity while being careful to remain critical. To dig into the logic behind the idea and attempt to discover something meaningful, let's return to the question, what makes an idea scientific? The question seems simple enough in theory, but in practice it is actually extremely difficult to pin down insofar as how the term science is used. Let us begin our exploration with the most basic meaning, the meaning which is most often implicitly understood, that being that a scientific idea is a true idea. Gravity is scientific because it happens. Science is real, that's why your computer works. Though perfectly coherent, this definition is incomplete and frankly pointless. If science were merely synonymous with truth, there would be no reason to invoke it as a distinct concept. Instead of accusing people of not believing in science, you could simply accuse people of not believing the truth, which would be even more persuasive. Indeed, then, there must be more to science than truth in and of itself, a kind of specification at the very least. Before we get there, we can go ahead and analyze another potential meaning for the word science. This one most commonly presented on a formal level. In this case, science refers to a set of processes combining theory and observation with logic in a set of steps in order to arrive at a set of conclusions. We typically call this the scientific method, as that is indeed what this process is, a method. A given idea can be called scientific then if it aligns with the set of conclusions derived through the scientific method. On an explicit level, this is probably what the majority of the mainstream recognizes as science, but again, it fails to fully capture what is meant in practice. This understanding, for one, is ultimately incompatible with the previous definition of science as truth. Indeed, on a probabilistic level, the conclusions derived from the scientific method are almost always untrue, in the sense that most studies have flaws, which are not, and in many cases could not have been realistically remedied. By its very nature, the scientific method is reliant on the process of constant refining because mistakes are a built-in feature. The reduction of the word science to the scientific method fails to explain why one is deemed a denier of science if they question or reject a particular conclusion derived through the scientific method in any particular contemporary form. As to question and challenge the existing paradigm is, in theory, part of the process itself. So far, none of what I've gone over is the most groundbreaking exposition. Verily, the ground is tread to the point that even the grass is struggling. And I've yet to really sustain what I promised in the title. Unfortunately, before I espouse any really novel ideas, there's still a little more background. The modern, or perhaps postmodern conception of science, rather than being solely synonymous with truth nor with the scientific method, can better be characterized as a troubled union between the two. This, I don't think, is constituted through the refining of science per se, but perhaps more accurately described as a redefining of truth. What I mean by this is that the truth has been replaced by whatever aligns with conclusions drawn through the scientific method. I'm being careful with my use of the word conclusions, as a decent case can be made for the truthfulness of the observations involved in scientific experiment, though there is a huge degree of confusion in the distinction between these two concepts. Traditionally, truth is understood as a metaphysical object aligning with a form of ultimate reality. Modernity obviously does not share this view. Instead, metaphysics as a whole are rejected in favor of materialism, though perhaps post-materialism would now be more accurate. Without metaphysics, another basis needed to be identified with which to prop up a new concept of truth, and science, in virtue of its mechanical success, was the prime candidate. It is important here to note that the scientific revolution itself was brought forth as a result of the idea that at bottom there was a metaphysical foundation, mostly theological, which supported a genuine order which governed the mechanical universe, a fundamentally logical basis for reality itself deriving from the highest being. It is easy then to point and laugh at the absurdity of the present form of scientific truth as I've described. It relies on a self-undermining rationale and plays pretend that the object of science, which is by its very nature ever-changing, somehow doubles as an undeniable truth. The question naturally arises then, from whence does science derive its foundation in this age? The confounding between the mechanical success of technology and the assumption-ridden set of conclusions may be effective at recruiting the public aboard the ship of the scientific establishment. But how does the ship itself decide which way to go? For this, we must understand not the metaphysical but anti-metaphysical views of the scientific community, the evolutionary view of natural history. In the latter half of the 19th century, Charles Darwin sought to describe the origin of species using the concept of natural selection. This was later refined by Herbert Spencer using the phrase survival of the fittest. Alongside the prior and posterior changes in our views of geology and cosmology respectively, a generally evolutionary view of history was produced. What I mean by evolutionary in this case is the positive sense of improvement, which most obviously manifested in the technological advances which coincided, like the evolution of vehicles becoming faster and more efficient. This, however, is not actually what is meant in a strict sense. Nature selects the most fit, not through a mechanical framework or analysis, but a reproductive one. Fitness is nothing more than the measure of proliferation. This is why it bothers not the evolutionist when their best examples of evolution in action all involve the elimination of mechanical function for environmental reasons. As to them, the only measure of success is sustenance. Now one may wonder, how does such a model resolve the issue of epistemological foundations? How does such a particular view define all of science? Well, it is not only the moth or the elephant which is subject to such a lens, but everything. The stars are just cosmic dust which became visible through sufficient gathering. Our planet a result of remnants from the exploded stars, which too exists because it managed to properly coalesce and remain intact. Our minds too are subject to such a view, as they would just be constructs from the material brains which exists because they allowed our ancestors to more efficiently reproduce. Our beliefs themselves, being products of the mind then, are extensions of this process. Using this logic, it becomes possible to define science through evolution. Science is the process of finding the fittest ideas, where fitness is the extent of reproduction and its acceptance. The fitter the idea, the more scientific it ought to be. In this view, it is neither truth nor methodology which ultimately makes an idea scientific. The truth is akin to mechanical function, something which may occur incidentally but is not necessary for scientific progress to take place. The scientific method is then a guide, the environmental pressures and natural processes which help ideas evolve, but they are not able to prescribe any formal goal. This formulation of science may seem totally absurd, but consider how the word is used in our culture. Phrases like scientific consensus or settled science directly insinuate this idea of science as a fixed idea. This is in direct conflict with the idea of truth, which would not need acceptance. Same with the scientific method, which is a process of constant change and renewal. Instead, it is in perfect harmony with the conception of science as a set of ideas successfully reproduced and accepted. With this, the seeming contradiction between the nature of consensus and science disappears. Instead, they become one and the same. Further, this explains the strange effect which seems to manifest whenever facts are discovered which force the consensus to change. In such a situation, those who anticipated the falsehood of the original consensus are never rewarded. And we are confused by this when we think of a constant truth which grounds science eternally. To the contrary, by using the evolutionary view, a new consensus is a brand new, successful population of ideas. The old ideas were fit in the past, as the new ideas become fit in the future, such that they can be equally considered scientific. The asserted importance of peer review is also clarified. Peer review is simply a form of natural selection and competition between ideas. It renders ideas not to repeated experiment, but to the opinions of others. As such, is again the measure of fitness in this case. Moving onward still, the obsession people seem to hold with regards to scientific opinions they had no part in developing, and through which they derive no personal benefit, is made sensible. By accepting a particular scientific opinion, one becomes a member of the ideological population, and thus joins the competition. The attempts to discredit opponents of a scientific idea is to participate in natural selection, to help one's team win. Remember that in this case, victory is defined by reproductive success. In other words, logical persuasion is only one valid strategy among many. Alternatives such as censorship or propaganda are equally valid. In the game of evolution, the only thing that matters after all is the battle of numbers. In a vacuum, it may seem inexplicable as to why a person would associate with an ideological team for no personal benefit and sometimes with personal costs. But it is important not to forget the big picture. There is a huge degree to which scientific ideas form alliances in order to succeed in a kind of symbiosis. As a result of these alliances, a general conception of science is generated, not relating to a single idea, but a grand set of all scientific ideas, that is to say, all commonly accepted ideas. By creating this package deal, beliefs about gravity are linked to beliefs about the history of trees, and as such, one is naturally inclined towards scientific ideas without direct conscious allegiance. To conclude, evolutionary theory provides an anti-metaphysical foundation for science which provides insight as to how science is conceived of today, not regarding how the word is formally defined in any dictionary, but how it is used in practice. Ideas are not scientific depending on their alignment with the truth, but instead upon the extent to which they are accepted. There's much more to go over regarding this topic, and I'm open to making follow-up videos about it. So many topics weave into this, you wouldn't believe it. That all being said, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you disagree with even a single one of my points, go ahead and leave your complaint in the comments down below. I am aware that the ideas presented are contentious, but they're all right, just saying. Make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed. If you made it this far, you must have, okay? Leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more. That's me all for today. Take care.